Welcome, Traceable Designers. Today we're making the dual fabric pleated center panel. This versatile panel can be hung with any of the Traceable Designer swag side panels along with connector panels. You can hang it using the long pleated side panels with additional center panels and connector panels, or use the panel as a wraparound side panel, add extra center panels and connector panels. You can also mix this with the pleated gathered styles. Use the straight style design form to make side panels or to make a gathered connector panel between your pleated side panels. You'll need your pleated swag center panel design form from your Traceable Designer kit. We'll begin by sizing our fabric. Make sure you have a very straight edge across the top and your fabric is folded. You can add extra space to the long side by simply sliding inside of the fold, or you can add extra room on the outside for a little larger panel. So make sure the fabric is wide enough for your selected size for your center panel, and then make sure that you move your design form down, leaving the 4-inch space on top for your rod pocket. And then you're just going to begin at the lower edge of the form. Since you're tracing on top of loose fabric, you want to go over it several times to make sure that the markings are visible. So just follow along the lower edge of the design form, making your trace marks. You will have your 2-inch pocket and a very straight edge on the top, so you won't have to trace across that and cut that. And then once you've finished tracing along the bottom, mark your 2 areas where your fabric shape will change. This is important so that you have nice crisp curves or nice crisp corners to give shape to your valance panel when it's finished. And then just follow along the trace line starting on the open edge of the fold, and just follow the line until you've cut out your panel. Obviously making sure that you're making the turns where you have the marks, and then if you have any excess on the side, just take that off. When sizing your lining, it's very important that it is wider than your valance fabric. The upper edge of the design form is the lining height cut line, so that you have an unlined rod pocket. So make sure that your lining is going to be larger by at least 1 inch or 2, and then that the top section is very, very straight, so that you will have that to make your rod pocket. So for cutting out your lining, you can just add some extra space. You can trace along the bottom, or you can just follow the line, making sure your form stays in position, and then just cut off the excess. So now we're going to attach the lining. So we're going to use the seam tape, and we're going to mark our rod pocket area. You don't want any seam tape above the rod pocket, so pull out your fusible seam tape, and beginning at your mark with the glue side facing down, with a dry iron, just start to fuse down on the right side, not the back. So just follow the seam tape along, no steam on your iron, and just fuse that down to the end, and then you'll cut that section off and continue around fusing the seam tape along the edges. It does straighten out your edges if they were uneven at all. So once you get to the curve part, or the change in the shape of the valance, you're just going to want to tear that off, and then make sure you have a nice V there, and then continue along the edge until you get to the next mark. Same thing, make sure you tear the tape and then start again with a nice V. You want to make sure both sides are even, so remember to do the same tearing and repositioning on the second half of the valance. Also, make sure you're not gluing your seam tape onto your ironing board. You want to make sure it stays inside of the edges a little bit, so that you don't have glue all over your ironing board. Then you can get that on the front of your valance, and it really can be a mess. So make sure you're really conscious of that, and that your shape is really coming together. Now, before you get to the second side and up to your rod pocket, you do want to definitely make sure that you've got that marked, and you know where to stop your tape. You don't want to position that over top of the rod pocket by accident and end up closing your rod pocket. So cut your seam tape and then fuse that down to finish the edges. Make sure your tape is 100% cooled before you peel it off, and make sure that your panel doesn't overlap and stick together while you're removing the tape. Then once you're finished with all of the tape, then you'll be able to put your lining on top of your valance fabric. You want to make sure right sides are together, because this will be reversed and you'll see the fabric. So when you're positioning your lining on top of your fabric, You want to really double check to make sure that that's correct. And then you're going to position your lining even with the glue on the upper section, leaving your rod pocket open. And then to hold it, just pull out your pins and put a little pin in the middle to begin your fusing. This helps this to not move. You want to make sure that your lining extends far beyond your edges. So you'll begin in the center with a sweeping motion and carefully attach your lining, and then moving up toward the open area. Once you've pushed everything up and out, you won't have any buckling in your fabric, and everything should stay nice and straight. The excess really does help because you want to make sure that you have covered all of the exposed glue. So continue going back to the center and out to the side for the entire fusing process, and then you'll be able to run your iron along the lower edges to finish the fusing process. Then once the panel has completely cooled, just take off any excess that is exposed from the lining on the back, and then snip your corners a little bit. You don't want to go beyond your seam tape, and then in any of the V's or any of the curves, you want to just do little tiny snips so that that'll help that turn more easily. Allow the panel to cool 100% before attempting to turn it, and then you're just going to carefully reverse your fabric. You're going to make sure that you put your hands in and push at the corners carefully to start to bring the shape together. You'll see little sections that need to be adjusted. So just take your time, and then you'll start on the back side fusing down your edges, and of course those will straighten out as you iron them. And then you're just going to do the same thing, sweeping from the edges out so that everything's nice and flat, and you'll see your shape start to come together. Once you've done the back side, turn it over and then run the iron across the front again. Just take your time to get it all nice and straight using the iron. You may want to check all of your curves by running your hand inside to make sure that you've got your shape completely in place. And then you're just going to fuse the back and make sure everything's nice and flat. Then we're going to move on to securing the lining to the back of the fabric so that it doesn't sag. We'll start with the side corners. You want that to be hidden completely underneath. Any seam tape should not be exposed with any glue. So I usually put the iron on it to get it started and then heat underneath so that that completely fuses. Then you're going to do both sides, and then we'll be securing the lining to the back. When you do insert your strip of seam tape behind, you don't want it to expose beyond the edge at all because that will close your pocket. So start by securing it on top of the lining and then put your iron underneath. At this point though, it can still move, so make sure it doesn't get fused beyond the lining edge. Once everything's cooled, remove your seam tape. When you do fold your seams over on the edges, you want to make sure they're completely covering the glue so nothing is exposed there. So once you do both sides, then go back and straighten everything completely before you fuse that lining down. You want that to be nice and flat. So using the center out sweeping motion, you'll just move up to the top of the lining so that you can secure that and prevent any sagging. It'll make your pleats a lot easier. Now your design form includes pleat guides, so in order to get this nice and straight, fold your fabric in half to get a nice seam there, and then put a pin to in the spot in the center so you know where the middle is. When we're starting with our pleats, this is all really a matter of how wide you want them. I'm going to do sort of a tight pleat, so you'll just pull each side over to the center and position it. When you think you have it where you want it, then you'll just run an iron over the sections. So once that's nice and straight and even on the bottom, then you'll run your iron on the first set of pleats. So once those have been flattened, then you'll take your next section and pull that over for your second pleat. These should be probably about 1.5 inches wide for the pleats, and you want to make sure the fabric's very straight up and down. So you just move it around until you get it the way you want it, and then just keep repositioning until you like the way the pleats look. You're also going to measure the panel to make sure that the sizing and the width is the way you like it, or it's supposed to be for your window size. So as you're moving your pleats along, you're also ironing them down to make them nice and crisp and flat. That will help you to see where the pleats begin. So at this point, I have a very wide pleated panel. I'm going to add one more section of pleats to bring mine a little bit more narrow. So then I'm pulling my third pleat over, and then I'm positioning that over top of the other pleats so that I like the shape. Make sure it's straight. One of the things that you want to double check here is that the outside edges are straight up and down. You are probably going to be covering this with a connector panel anyway, so you won't see it, but it's best if it's straight on the side so that whatever is butting up against it or over top of it is nice and straight. So make sure these sides are straight before you start fusing your pleats in place. So pull out your fusible backing sheet. You've got a nice big piece in there, and then cut about 1-inch sections to insert behind your pleats. You want to make sure these are hidden completely behind. You don't want any exposed glue. So if you have to trim them to make them fit, go ahead and do that. You'll make 6. In my case, I'm making 6 pieces and inserting them behind my pleats, making sure not to move the pleats around, but make sure they stay intact. It's best to have your fusible lining all the way to the top. It helps with the rod pocket, but you don't want anything extending beyond the bottom either. So where the pleats curve, there's a little angle, and you want to make sure that the fusible backing doesn't get exposed beyond there, so you can cut the little sections as you need to and then fuse those behind. So once everything's been fused in place and you really like the positioning and you've double checked the size, once the pieces have completely cooled, the fusible backing can then be removed from behind each section. I recommend removing all the pieces of tape first, and then you'll be able to fuse everything down as one piece. This is a long process only because you've got so many layers of fabric, so you want to make sure you don't burn your fabric when you're fusing. So you want to keep the iron moving. Don't press and leave it in one spot. You could have iron marks. Do use a piece of spare lining when you're doing this and press down to make sure that those are held in place. So you will be using pressure. Then flip it over once it's cooled and do the same thing on the back. Now the back, they don't have to go the full length, just really up at the rod pocket section. Fuse everything behind there, and then you'll have everything intact. Once you've removed all the paper, again, fuse the pleats in line. Okay, for the final step, we're going to make a rod hanging pocket. So when you fold your pocket over, you want to make sure it doesn't overlap onto the back of your lining, and then you just sort of fuse that down to hold it in place. Cut fusible backing strips to add to the back of your pocket, but don't overlap, again, over onto your ironing board or on top of the lining section. Then once that has completely cooled, you'll just peel that paper off to expose the rod pocket glue. Before you fuse your pocket in place, just do a double check if you're using side panels to make sure the length is the same. In this case, I am going to remove about 1/4 inch off of mine, so I'm going to fold my pocket over with the lining section to make it a little bit shorter to match. You'll probably use it with connector panels, but you still want to make sure it's even. So when you're fusing this down, use spare lining, a lot of heat, and press to get that pocket completely secured before you hang it. So you don't want to burn the fabric, so just use this process with the lining. Then once the rod pocket has completely cooled, just carefully slip the rod through your rod pocket, add any side panels, and hang your beautiful new pleated style valance. Thank you for joining me, Traceable Designers, and remember, you can always make your mark with Traceable Designer.